Are you a gamer who feels hesitant to play RPGs with themes of horror? Is your usual response when invited to play a horror-themed RPG, that type of game just isn't my jam, or not my vibe, or isn't my cup of tea? In this episode, I have the pleasure to speak with veteran game designer and lifelong gamer, Kenneth Hite. Since 1981, Ken has been designing games, professionally designing them since 1995, and he's been playing them for even longer. What makes Ken uniquely qualified to talk about the horror genre? He has designed games such as Trail of Cthulhu, Knight's Black Agents, and Vampire the Masquerade 5th Edition, as well as many more titles. He has co-hosted the long-running podcast Ken and Robin Talk About Stuff, diving into many topics, one of which is hobby gaming. They've produced more than 600 episodes and don't show any signs of slowing down. And lastly, he writes regular articles for Pelgrane Press exploring history, art, and especially tabletop gaming with themes of horror. Welcome to Claim to Game, the podcast helping busy people master tabletop role-playing games one game at a time. I'm Clint.scheirer. I've been an educator for over 12 years and have helped gamers of all levels quickly grasp tabletop RPGs so they can enjoy playing them to the fullest. Stay tuned so you can make your claim to game. Ken, hello and welcome to Claim to Game. I'm glad to have you here to answer some very specific questions related to tabletop RPG horror and the genre surrounding it. So thanks for being here on the pod.
Oh, thanks very much, Clint. Thanks for inviting me.
Now, I wanted to really get to the core of what you believe the horror genre is. So I set a rule, a parameter. You have 10 words, no more, no less, to give me your mission statement, or I guess your definition of what you believe a tabletop horror RPG is designed to provide players when they're sitting at the table getting ready to play.
All right. 10 words. Horror games allow players access to the most powerful emotion.
The most powerful emotion. Now, if I would have given you an 11th word, Ken, what is that most powerful emotion?
Fear.
Fear, there's nothing to fear but fear itself, I've heard. Why do you believe it's the most powerful emotion?
Well, I mean, first of all, fear is the one that is evolved into us from before we're even human, right? I mean, it's a purely animal emotion. Anger is process of having, self-conceptions. Love, obviously, is to the extent it's an emotional as opposed to a biological urge, is, the notion of recognizing that other people are also people. All the other emotions come out of consciousness, come out of, knowing who we are. Fear is programmed into us by evolution. It's like we evolved in the African savannas and we were surrounded by tigers and lions and mad water buffaloes and Lord knows what, giant snakes. And we had to know fear. We had to be able to be scared and run. And that level of biological, hard-coded root access stays in us. And as Lovecraft said, the oldest and most powerful emotion in mankind is fear. And he goes on to say, and the greatest fear is the fear of the unknown, which is why most horror games are structured as mysteries, because you are trying to figure out what's going on so that you can get that frisson of the fear of the unknown, even if it's like, well, we're playing vampires, so I'll bet vampires are involved somehow. But you have that moment of what could it be, and that frisson is the sort of the icing on the cake of fear. But fear itself is just a fundamentally powerful emotion, and also it's easier to bring up in play than love for many reasons, and it's more salutary and better for you than bringing up hatred, which is just, disgusting. No one should be role-playing to feel hate. That's what internet is for. So the notion of being able to drill down into that pure pre-human primordial emotion and bring it up is something that only horror gaming can do. Drawing up this this great undersea well of powerful emotion.
Now, as you were speaking, 3 words came up, synonyms, if you will, and maybe I'm picking at straws, but fear, terror, and horror. Do you believe there's a difference between those 3?
The words connote different things, and you will get different horrorists describing the emotions in different ways. Often, you will have people conflate horror with dread, that horror is the thing that is going on when you don't know what's endangering you, and terror is the thing that goes on when you do know and are running away from it, or fighting against it, depending on the response. Fear is the sort of overarching emotion that encompasses all of those. I feel like you can cheese pair it as you want. I like Stephen King's discussion that there is dread, terror, and revulsion. I think I like the addition of that. That's fun. But again, Lovecraft has his own version. Stephen King has his own version. Everyone who's written or thought about horror literature, horror movies, horror games, cuts and pastes it in their own way. But it's all, coming from that same taproot, which is why you are trying to sort of evoke the whole panoply of those things in a given game session, ideally.
So thinking of the game session, thinking of the game, as a game designer, I went way back. I went in the Wayback Machine, and you did an interview back in 2011, which I guess isn't that far back.
Getting far back now, yeah.
Yeah, it feels far back. In 2011, you did an interview with David McWilliam. And in that interview, you stated that 2 essentials to creating a strong horror game is a truly horrifying message and an audience willing to be scared. Do you still stand by those answers, or in 13 years, do you feel like anything has changed?
Well, I mean, Clint, I'm generally right when I say things. And in this case, I'm still right. I might tweak the first one to say rather than a horror message, because that implies a didacticism that obviously is fatal to art of any kind. I would say a horror experience or a horror impression, even depending on what your notion of what art is meant to communicate. As Samuel Goldwyn famously said, movies are for entertainment, for messages use Western Union. So the horror message should not be, vote right or eat your vegetables or whatever. The message should be this fundamental thing about the universe is terrifying, but the experience is king. The players willing to be scared has been rock bottom true since I formulated that back in the 90s in a book that I called Nightmares of Mine for Iron Crown, and later then recycled into GURPS Horror, where the long, wordy with statistics version of this podcast can be found. So the players willing to be scared is really the ultimate, the 0th level of buy-in. You have to have that, because one player screwing around on their phone or doing, Buffy references blows the mood, because we're social animals, right? As I say, we're the good part is we're evolved to feel fear. The bad part is that if one of our monkeys in the troop is like, don't worry, it was just a cloud, then we all go back to eating fruit and screwing around. You want to have everyone willing to buy in and feel the experience. It's not like a roller coaster where if one guy's checked out, everyone else is having fun. This is a communication. This is an art form. It's not an adrenaline stimulator.
So I'm going to flip-flop what we're going to talk about, because I think the next question leads into what you were talking about. An audience willing to be scared. I was speaking with a friend just the other day. You were the inspiration for this conversation and also for this question. I was speaking with this friend just the other day. He responded with the following when I asked him to participate in a horror-themed game that we're getting ready to do, in Halloween time, or we're getting ready in October already. And he said, I do not mind being scared, but there are certain horror elements I just don't enjoy at all. Torture, cannibalism, the harm to children. I've tried those elements in RPGs and movies that I've watched, and it's just a straight no for me. Now, without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, What's some encouragement or direction that you could give this dude that maybe would help him overcome an aversion to horror, to not maybe enjoy the element of fear, but be able to experience that as was meant to be in these games, which actually can be fun.
Well, I mean, here's the thing, right? He gave you 3 things, cannibalism, harm to children, and torture. Well, there's a lot of horror that is not any of those things. Vampirism, fear of disease, lots of other great fears that you can play on that don't involve those things. And I have said since 97, in writing that, playing with genuine trauma is bad and don't do it, right? If someone has got a real psychological hard break, they don't want to have sexualized horror. They don't want rape imagery. They don't want harm to children. They don't want torture of animals. Everyone's got stuff. And what you want to do ideally is separate trauma, which is no one is paid enough to deal with that shit, from mere phobia, right? So I have a phobia about rats. I don't like rats. I don't like seeing them. I don't like knowing they exist. I live in Chicago, so every now and again I get a little jolt of adrenaline, unwillingly. But if someone says, we're going to run a game, Ken, and it is going to be rat phobia central, I'd say yes. That's a guaranteed turn on for me, in the sense of I will be scared. I would say embrace your phobias, but wall off your traumas to the extent you can. But for that player, I would say, great, we're not going to do those things. Thank you for telling me, because otherwise, the story of the cannibal torturer who injured children was going to be kind of the central part of this story. And now it's going to be a poisoning vampire who threatens old people. And now you can do that. And you can still build horror out of a billion different ingredients. I mean, you look at even Eli Roth has movies that aren't about torture and cannibalism. So imagine the rest of horror. And again, everyone's trauma, everyone's hard break is their hard break. And I would never judge someone about it and say, oh no, you have to put on your big boy pants. This is horror. I would say, know the difference between your phobias and your traumas, and enjoy your phobias in a safe environment, because a table with dice is much safer than an alley in Chicago. I would say horror is innately about transgression. It's about things that shouldn't happen happening, or the fear of that happening. And so there's going to be some inescapable element of that, but I can't imagine anyone who is literally checked out of every single horror component in the world, like no vampires, no Satan, no Cthulhu. I mean, at some point, all right, I said that. Now obviously there's people out there, vegans for horror, but I think that the majority of people have got, a place they don't want to go and a place they're happy to go, or not happy to go, but are excited to go. Don't psychologically torture your friends. I think surely this goes without saying. Psychologically mess with your friends, I think, is fine. I mean, that's what friends are for.
Friends are for psychologically messing with you.
That's not all of it, but it's always part of it, I think.
So when you were talking about a player giving information to maybe somebody who's running the game, I think of that as, the GM taking in account the traumas that certain players have bringing to the table. As a fellow player, maybe that's not something you're aware of, that somebody doesn't like cannibalism. And so sitting at the table, not knowing those things, you might accidentally stumble upon cannibalism,
right.
Or you might accidentally whatever. What I've been told is having a session 0 is a good way before a game to get all of that out in the open. Like, okay, guys or gals, this is the hard stops. Like, this is what we don't bring to the table. Is that what you've found in your time running games and playing games, is that having those expectations beforehand is helpful?
If you have the luxury of that, that's very good. There's all kind of mini games you can play in the session 0 to set up the thing. Dread has a great pre-game game where you're asking questions about your character and building their psychology out. Just a list of yeses and nos is perfectly legit thing to do in a session 0. In a one shot, obviously it's harder to do that. And You may not want to like shoot your bolt and spoil the surprise, spoil the frisson of mystery, but that's why safety tools like the X card exist. And if you're playing with people that are worried about their reaction, or you're worried about their reaction, having the X card available at the table is just that's certainly sound if that's the kind of group you're with. Other people, of course, and like all teenage boys everywhere, are like, no, nothing can stop us. Bring it on. The more horrible, the better, which is also great. I mean, that's very freeing and fun and liberatory. But like everything teenage boys do, it should probably not be a model for everyone's behavior forever.
Yeah. My son is not a teenager yet, but I'm gearing up.
Yeah.
It's only a matter of time. You mentioned the X card. Okay. For this podcast, there may be people who are new to the hobby, people who haven't played before. What is the purpose of the X card? That's something that's I've seen come out more recently, but maybe it's been around for longer than I know.
I mean, it's not super long. I mean, I think the principle has sort of been there because, again, I wrote about it. So a game designer friend of mine named John Stavropoulos sort of codified and formalized the X card, invented it, published it, whatever you want to call it, in 2013. And what it is at its simplest, you take a index card or whatever and you write a big X on it. And maybe every player has one, or maybe you put it in the middle of the table. And if something's happening that is a hard stop, you go out and you touch the X card, or you hold up your X card. And at that moment, you do what you can to sort of rewind a little bit, back away from it, and go a different direction. If accidentally you've blown up the game, that's too bad, but at least you haven't really offended, angered, injured, traumatized your friend, which is what you don't want to do. As you play with people more, you get a sense of where their boundaries are naturally. And so you know to avoid stuff, like with anyone. When you're out with your friends in a bar, sometimes, you know, they don't want to be teased about whatever. So you tease them about everything else in their life. And it's just extending that courtesy to the gaming table. The X card is just a really efficient and elegant mechanical way to do it at the table with a minimum of faffing around and back chat. And it's just a simple red light. You can Google it. There's, you know, stuff on websites for safety tools. Various game companies have those. The 5th edition of Vampire has a big section in the core book on safety tools. So they're all there. And I think the X card is the simplest, most elegant one of them. But depending on your group and what you're expecting, more is, you know, always available.
That sounds like it would be really helpful at conventions when you are playing those one shots, and they're
convention games are the real landmine, because you have no idea what anyone's like. You don't know if they're going to be some sort of serial killer who's on work release. You don't know if they're going to be a nice person who's never even heard of the French New Wave of horror and is just shocked at the mere concept. You just really have no idea what anyone is like. And so I think it's really a good system for convention games or something like that. Again, with your friends, you generally have a pretty good idea about the line between phobia and trauma. So I have a friend who years and years ago told me that he really hated moths when they, you know, flap up against your face, and that sort of squicked him out really hardcore. It wasn't, you know, like a moth ate my mom. It was like, I hate moths. And so, of course, then I put the Mothman into an adventure in about 3 months after he'd forgotten he'd told me that, and really messed him up, which was the goal. But again, teenage boys. I was in my 20s, so I don't have an excuse, but he was a teenager.
Now, I'm going to backtrack again back to what I was going to ask. And since we've talked about, you know, Vampire Masquerade 5th edition having the X card rules and tools built into it, you know, game design can build tools, but also there are some games that really build that horrifying message.
Yeah.
Or we kind of changed it, the horrifying element or experience. Can you give me an example of a game that you feel really provides a great, truly horrifying element just baked in?
The classic example is Call of Cthulhu, designed by Sandy Peterson, the legendary, the great Sandy Peterson in 1981. Call of Cthulhu is the first game ever to introduce basically mental hit points, the sanity mechanic. And the way that sanity worked in Call of Cthulhu is that it always went down. It was a death spiral. And so you knew, basically baked into the setting, baked into the rules, that your character was fragile and would be destroyed. And by knowing that, it has created a culture in which any game, if it has the words of Cthulhu on the front, players know what to expect. They go into it eager to be brutalized and driven mad and see things that they can't comprehend and have horrible, horrible experiences of the kind that if you were playing, a regular fantasy role-playing game, they would feel very violated. They say, why is my character suddenly weak and powerless? I demand +9 acts of smiting. But in of Cthulhu, it's like, yes, absolutely. I have been walled up in a warehouse and I'm going to be eaten by invisible chuds. I buy it. That will happen. And that willingness to embrace that frailty, that vulnerability is just so core for creating a player base that is willing to be scared that literally every designer since Sandy has been ripping Sandy off, either openly or less openly, ever since, because that is how you build it. And that sort of mechanical drive to create weakness and vulnerability is something that Sandy did perfectly, and that to an extent in the newest vampire game, Karim Muammar's hunger mechanic, as the vampires become hungrier, they're now at greater and greater risk of losing control of the beast within. And that's the horror of vampire. The horror of vampire is not you wake up and you're a serial killer. The horror of vampire is knowing that you can even be a worse monster if you ever let go. And so that internal personal horror is really the core experience of vampire. And I think Karim's hunger mechanic is the first hunger mechanic, the first blood mechanic in the history of that game to really dial it in and lock it down the way that Sandy's sanity mechanic did back in 1981 for Cthulhu. But there's many other games that do it. Don't Rest Your Head has a great death spiral about your character can't ever sleep. Dread, of course, has the Jenga tower, which is what it is. Lots of games have these sorts of more or less degrees of economy and design. Some of it is just quite simple. Oh, the monsters are all more powerful than you, so you have to fight smart or you have to learn to run. And that's something that I did, for example, in Night's Black Agents, which shares with Sandy, or rather steals from Sandy, a little bit of a death spiral, but the economy is much more forgiving in Night's Black Agents than it is in, say, Fall of Delta Green, my pure, hardest core Lovecraftian game, where sanity is deliberately stripped away from you constantly.
You gave us plenty of options here of tabletop RPG horror games that you feel do a really good job of introducing people to that sanity mechanic, or you mentioned the hunger, but also just you're not going to win.
Yeah. Or you're at least vulnerable. You're vulnerable and potentially weak. Night's Black Agents is Jason Bourne versus Dracula, so there is a different presupposition than in Call of Cthulhu, where you are Arkham Hobo versus Yog-Sothoth. The table stakes are different in every one of these games, but the goal is at least to be open to that vulnerability and that weakness and that danger that lets you then play someone who is being menaced, something that you are scared of, and can then draw up that horror, that fear from within yourself.
Can you think of a time, and it could be either a game that you ran and you experienced another player going through it, or it was a game that you were playing where you were going through it as your own character, where after you were done, you're like, that's it. That's why I play horror games. This is the fear, that primal emotion that we were talking about at the very beginning. Like, this is it. Do you have an example of that?
That was literally 8 years of running Call of Cthulhu from the time I bought it in 1981 to when I left Oklahoma City. I had a campaign with my group, or actually by the time I left, I had, I think, 4 campaigns with various groups of friends, and Call of Cthulhu just always reliably produced it. I mean, there was times like when we were doing an adventure set in Innsmouth, full of, creepy fish frogs and marine monstrosities, and we were doing it on a houseboat in Grand Lake, Oklahoma. That obviously is leaning in, and you get moments where characters are genuinely terrified to open a door. Players are terrified to open a door, but they know that they have to. And you get that pure moment. And that happened over and over and over again in Call of Cthulhu, because it could be really, really bad. And I've been GM for life since the 70s, so I don't have a ton of play experiences where that happens for me. I'm always very gratified when it happens to my players. When I was doing the alpha play test of Night's Black Agents and they first met the sort of giant stone elder vampire from before civilization was born. And they sort of walk into his chamber and they're confronted with the sort of scope of what they were fighting. That was a great moment. And everyone, I think, really felt it. My friend, the designer Will Heinmarch, runs a Halloween role-playing game most years. And I'm sometimes lucky enough to play in that. And he has just a really great ability to sort of just slide you in. It's almost like a magician's trick. Like, it's like, no, nothing can go wrong here. Da, 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 da. And he's playing the music in the background. He's very good at using music at the table, which I'm terrible at. And then before you know it, you are in a situation where you're like, well, if I jump off the ship, I will drown and die. Is that better than staying in this scenario? And you're genuinely weighing a moment of, is this despair? Do I have existential despair or just regular despair? The ability that he has of just sort of shutting doors behind you as you idiotically walk through them. He's one of the best GMs I've ever played with. He's a great horror designer, great game designer in general. He ran Vampire the Requiem back when that was a thing, put together Vampire Mythologies, which was one of the best books on the line, Damnation City, one of the best books on the line, Chronicler's Guide, one of the best books on the line ever for any vampire game. So he really knows his stuff. And, when you've got a good GM like that and you walk through that door on purpose, yeah, that's your job as the player, is to walk through. And then his job is to shut the door with a really menacing snick. And that, gets you going.
Do you have any things that you like to do to set the mood when you're the GM? Like, I know, for example, a game called 10 Candles that I played. I love that game. And in the game, it's mechanic. A great game. Yeah. The mechanic of the candles going out, and eventually you're in the dark and you're listening to the recording of your character. It's just phenomenal. So, like, do you have any elements that, besides music, besides lighting, that can really enhance the horror fear?
Every GM is different. Every GM is good or bad at some things. And obviously dim lighting or lighting that only is at the table, that's sort of standard at this point. I try not to mess around with candles or music because it's hard enough to keep track of the game and read all the players without also worrying someone's going to set themselves on fire, or I've hit the wrong music cue and suddenly Britney Spears is there instead of Holst or whatever. I try to keep it all words and communication. And a lot of it is just read the room. And this is 0th level GMing of any genre, but read the room, see when the characters of the players are beginning to check out, and then find a hook for them and pull them back in. And it's so much improving. Even if you're doing it in a pre-written scenario, you're still improving the responses that will draw a specific player to a specific event. I don't rely on any sort of music or lighting or anything like that, mostly because I would be terrible at it and it would ruin it for me. People who can do it, great. And something like 10 Candles, where you're almost building a performance art space more than a role-playing game, or in addition to a role-playing game, or Dread to another extent, are their own thing. And I feel like, running Call of Cthulhu with 10 Candles would just be annoying.
Yeah.
Because the candles would keep going out. One of the key elements for me as a horror GM is pacing. And a candle going out is someone else controlling pacing, not me, the GM, controlling pacing. So it's back and forth. Obviously you can improv through it in 10 Candles, but I like to have pacing, and I like to be able to speed up or slow down the roller coaster depending on what buy-in I'm sensing from around the table.
Yeah. It's really a call to go back to the basics, that your words matter, your pacing matters, how you're saying things matter, your tone matters, not so much the environment that you're trying to control.
I mean, some of it is just, do you use silly voices for the deep ones? What level are you trying to communicate, and how good are you at it? This is a classic from me, is I did a sort of a Pepperidge Farms, Massachusetts accent for a deep one hybrid that the players met in a Call of Cthulhu game that I was running. And they loved this guy's accent. They wanted me to do the accent all the time. So they kept him alive. They didn't kill him like they did most of their Deep One informants. And then would go back and they said, let's go interrogate Zephus again. It's like, God damn it. And so the trick is that because they're really dialed in on the accent, you have to really think of the worst thing he could possibly say to them. Sort of like, you're playing chicken with them now. I'm going to say something so horrible that you're going to want to kill Zephus. My goal is to stop doing this dumb voice. Your goal is to get information, but also make me keep doing the dumb voice. And so to do that, I'm going to load that information with the worst things I can possibly put in. And so you can wind up taking a thing that was a little bit comical, a little bit funny, and then you turn it around and now it's really awful. And now they don't want to hear him talk, but now he keeps going on and on about the things that he's seen inside them or heard in their dreams or whatever it is. That was the immediate threat that he was able to unleash even in his position of captivity. But that's what you have to do, right? You hit a moment where it sounds like it's going to work, or it works great in your head, and the players don't buy it, or they grab onto the wrong 10% of the iceberg, and you have to sort of rotate and play. And that's what makes it, in my mind, the best art form, is because it is always improvisational and always collaborative and always cooperative. Greg Stafford used to say that the only thing like it is jazz, where the players are the audience. And it's like a jazz breakdown session, not like a performance, but like just a jam session between players who are all playing and all handing each other the riff to go back and forth. I think even if you can't play a standing bass to save your life, you can all do that.
Now, the question I have to know, did they kill Zephus?
Eventually, yes, they had to kill Zephus. It was too horrible.
R.I.P. Zephus.
The fact that they kept talking to him exposed them to the Deep One telepathy, basically. And so it's like we are now basically in a classic espionage situation where by tapping our source, we're revealing our goals. And so they had to kill Zephus. Bury him in the desert. That's how it works.
Bury him in the desert and no more Pepperidge Farm accent.
No.
What is your elevator pitch if somebody is still on the fence after hearing all that we've talked about? They're still on the fence of giving the horror genre or tabletop RPG a chance.
I mean, my elevator pitch is, if they've never played a role-playing game at all, my pitch is, this is like the cheapest movie night you'll ever have. Even if you splash out like a big spender and buy a core book that's $50 amongst 4 of you, that's way cheaper than going to the movies. And then with that one core book, and this is a thing that we don't like to say because we have to keep writing supplements, that Call of Cthulhu core book lasted me 8 years of just riffing and messing with people. And it's a great way to make your own art. Be a creator, not a passive consumer, not just sucking at the Netflix Disney teat. Put stuff into your art that you want to see. This is the way to do it. For horror, I would, go back to, this is the only way to genuinely experience role-playing with an emotional valence. You might feel serotonin hit when you beat up a bunch of orcs, but you weren't really in combat. You didn't really care whether the orcs won or lost. I mean, there wasn't a stake in it for you. Maybe there's a little bit of ego, but there was, you've never met an orc in your life. You have no opinion about orcs. But thinking about, oh no, that old person or child could be their life force is dwindling away. I'm letting this person die in front of me. I could stop it. That's real. And if stopping it risks my existence, that's fear. That's something that you're bringing that up, and you can bring that up. And it's just, I think, in my experience, a more satisfying and powerful kind of play. And again, there's nothing wrong with killing orcs. I've killed more orcs than I've had hot meals, but it's a different thing. It's like, playing a computer game or whatever. It's like, fine, knock yourself out, but it's not, it doesn't draw from anything real.
Do you have any current projects, Ken, that are currently upcoming, something that you're excited about that you'd want to share with anybody who's listening?
We are actually taking Trail of Cthulhu. Speaking of ripping off Sandy, we're taking Trail of Cthulhu, which I did for Pelgrane Press in 2008. It is being taken back into Santa's workshop and getting a couple more shiny lights. And we're doing the second edition. We'll be kickstarting that this fall. Some of the design work that myself and Gareth Ryder Hanrahan, who partnered up with me on Dracula Dossier and is the younger, smarter, faster, better me. We're doing some great stuff for the second trail. It'll still be all the Trail of Cthulhu stuff that you love, backwards compatible, but trying to take the Jiminy 15 years of Gumshoe experience that we've had and put some of that into the game engine. I mean, Trail of Cthulhu was the second or third Gumshoe game to come out. Robin had not even finished fixing, solving, improving, bettering, evolving Gumshoe. And certainly I hadn't done it. And so there's just literally, thousands, hundreds of thousands of hours of play there for people. And we can draw on some of that experience and make the game once more accessible and make it even a game that isn't, well, I like Call of Cthulhu. I'll bet I'll like this other of Cthulhu. Maybe this can now be your first Lovecraftian game or your first horror game. And that'll be nice, is if we can do that, with the new edition. So I'm very excited about Horror Second. And then I'm also working on a book, for Vampire, that is about how to add more horror to your vampire game in case it wasn't horrible enough. So there's going to be different kinds of horror, different flavors, everything that you think is awful about the vampire universe. Well, if you take a second look, it's even worse. And so this book it's currently being called Tattered Façade. I don't know that we're going to stick with that all the way through, but so far, but it's going to be about that book of second looks, about the skull beneath the skin, as Eliot said, or rather, I guess John Webster said, but Eliot said it later. So that's going to be a fun thing to do with that.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to both of those. I read the Pelgrane Press bio of Trail of Cthulhu, and then I saw your article back, I think it was maybe September of this last year, talking about the second edition coming out. So that'll be awesome.
Yeah, that was when we had a different production schedule. But in the article, I said November, but I didn't say which November. So
that's right. It could be. There's so many Novembers.
But we're pretty sure it'll be this November now, or this fall anyway, maybe even this October.
Awesome. Well, maybe that's the game that we'll play now that my friend will be convinced to play with us, our horror game.
One hopes, yeah. If you back it early, you should be getting the manuscript anyway, the PDF.
Nice. The other thing I was going to ask is, where can listeners find you online if they wish to connect with you or your works? Where's the best place? One
of the best places is to listen to Ken and Robin talk about stuff, the podcast I share with my inspiration and cross-border life partner, Robin Laws. We talk about all kind of things. There is a regular horror hut that comes up. There's a gaming hut every session where we talk about best practices and things, how to make your game better. And then everything that we do is usually turned toward how do you use it in a game. And that might be some sort of elliptonic flying saucer nonsense. It might be a weird historical thing. It might be a movie that we both loved or hated, whatever it is. It's a bunch of little discrete segments. It's not two guys babbling on endlessly. We babble on in 15-minute chunks. Thank you very much. So it's a good place. And if your heart is moved to join the Patreon for that, then you will have a world of interaction, mostly with Robin. I'm on Twitter, Kenneth Hite. I'm on Facebook, Kenneth Hite. Easy to find. And that's where to sort of keep track of me if you're trying to, figure out when my next project is dropping or whatever. Or you just want to drop onto a picture of my cat and say, how much you enjoyed this podcast. That would be lovely.
Are there any questions you think I missed? Any final thoughts that you feel would be a shame if we just didn't get to it?
This is, as you say, sort of the intro horror role-playing what is thing. And I think that we've covered that turf pretty well. Obviously, there's a million roads you can go down. You can talk about all the kinds of other different types of horror, how to play horror, or whatever kind of a thing. That's why you have my books, is to read those things. I think we're great.
Well, Ken, thanks for being here today. We hope to have you on the pod again, and I can't wait to talk to you. You are an excellent individual. You made me laugh so many times today.
Oh, that's nice of you to say.
Join us next time as we continue our quest, Claiming Goblin Quest. With 3 rules hacks down, we got 4 more hacks to go. Our next one is different from all the others. Instead of the action revolving around comedy, we see a shift to the very genre that Ken Hite just encouraged us to give a chance. The theme of horror. Prepare to seek the truth, go mad, and die quickly in The Cthulhu Files. Have you been listening to the first season of the CTG and do not yet have your very own copy of Goblin Quest, the RPG? Picture yourself pretending to be gross, grotty little buggers on your next game night with your closest friends. Laughs, goofs, and goblins. Don't wait. Click on the link in the show notes. Don't like goblins? Enjoy the 7 different Goblin Quest setting hacks in the back of the core rulebook. It's almost like you're getting 8 games for the price of 1. Enjoy your copy of Goblin Quest, the RPG, today. And until the next time we make our claim to game, 1 game at a time.